The word landed in the center of the room like something thrown. Barren Pig Gloria Reyes said, smiling as if it were a toast. Crystal glasses paused midair. Conversations died without protest. No one corrected her, not even Santiago. Peyton Hayes stood beside the gift table, hands still, eyes steady. She didn't flinch, didn't speak, didn't cry. What no one in that room knew, what Gloria had already lost control of, rested quietly inside the envelope Peyton held against her side. Proof doesn't raise its voice. It waits. If you believe dignity doesn't always need noise, stay with this story. Before we go on, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if stories about quiet strength and truth matter to you, consider subscribing. Peyton Hayes had learned long before she married into the Reyes family that silence was not emptiness. It was storage. She stored details the way others stored emotions, carefully, methodically, without display. A passing comment, a delayed response, a glance held half a second too long. Nothing in her world was ever truly lost. It was cataloged. At 32, Peyton worked as a compliance analyst for a mid-sized financial firm in Chicago. Her job was not glamorous, but it was precise. She specialized in identifying inconsistencies, patterns that didn't align, numbers that moved without explanation, systems that appeared clean on the surface but carried quiet distortions underneath. She didn't accuse. She didn't speculate. She verified. It was a profession that rewarded patience. And Peyton had always been patient. When she met Santiago, Reyes' patience did not feel like a strategy. It felt like calm. Santiago was polished in the way people trusted. He spoke carefully, listened with intention, and knew when to pause just long enough to seem thoughtful. As a corporate attorney at a prestigious firm, he understood presentation not only in courtrooms, but in life. He knew how to shape perception. He noticed Peyton's restraint and mistook it for gentleness. She noticed his control and understood it as structure. They met somewhere in the middle, where neither of them had to explain too much. Their relationship moved forward without turbulence. No dramatic declarations, no visible fractures. Just steady progression, dinners, shared routines, eventual marriage. The Reyes family approved quickly. That, in hindsight, had been the first anomaly. The Reyes name carried weight. Their wealth came from Reyes Group, a family-owned logistics and infrastructure company that had grown aggressively over 2 decades. They were respected in business circles, feared in negotiations, and carefully curated in public image. At the center of that structure stood Gloria Reyes. Gloria did not raise her voice often. She didn't need to. Authority followed her naturally, shaped by years of control over the company, over her social circles, and most importantly, over her family. She had built a life where outcomes bent in her direction. From the beginning, she treated Peyton with a kind of measured politeness. Not warmth, not hostility, something more conditional, observation. At family dinners, Gloria asked questions that sounded harmless, but carried weight beneath them. How is work? Peyton still reviewing other people's mistakes? Do you enjoy being behind the scenes? Do you ever think about building something of your own? Each question was followed by a pause, not for an answer, but for evaluation. Peyton responded the same way she always did. Calm, brief, complete. She did not fill silence for other people's comfort. Santiago, on the other hand, adjusted. He laughed lightly when conversations edged toward tension. Redirected when necessary, explained Peyton in ways Peyton never asked to be explained. She's just private, he would say. She takes time to open up. She's very thoughtful. Each statement was accurate. None of them were complete. The first year of marriage passed without incident. The second introduced a shift so subtle it could have been mistaken for coincidence. It began with questions. At first, they came from extended relatives, casual, expected. So when are we going to hear some good news? Any plans for kids? Don't wait too long, Peyton answered politely. Non-committal. Time would come. Gloria did not ask, not immediately. Instead, she watched. At dinners, her gaze lingered longer on Peyton than before. Conversations shifted slightly, orbiting around family's legacy continuity. The word future appeared more often. It was rarely defined. Santiago began to notice the pattern, but only at the surface level. "They don't mean anything by it," he told Peyton one evening, loosening his tie as he stood in their kitchen. "It's just how they are." Peyton rinsed a glass slowly, water running over her hands. "Patterns mean something," she said. Santiago smiled, but it was the kind of smile that closed conversations, rather than opening them. "You see patterns everywhere." He said it as reassurance. Peyton heard it as dismissal. By the third year, the questions stopped sounding casual. They became directed. At a dinner hosted in Gloria's home, surrounded by extended family and business associates, the shift crystallized. A cousin announced her pregnancy. Applause followed. Glasses lifted. Gloria stood embracing the woman with visible pride. "This family continues," Gloria said, her voice carrying just enough to reach the far end of the table. Her eyes moved, not quickly, but deliberately, toward Peyton. "For some of us," she added, "it happens naturally." No one reacted. Not openly. That was the structure of the Reyes family. Discomfort was not acknowledged. It was absorbed, redirected, or ignored. Peyton placed her napkin on her lap and continued eating. She did not respond. She did not need to. Because in that moment, something had already begun to shift, not in the room, but in her understanding of it. Pressure, Peyton knew, rarely appeared all at once. It accumulated, layer by layer, comment by comment, until it created a narrative that felt inevitable. And narratives once established were difficult to dismantle, unless someone documented them. That night, when they returned home, Santiago moved through their apartment with practiced normalcy. Jacket hung, shoes aligned, phone checked. "Don't take it personally," he said, as if the evening required closure. Peyton sat at the small desk in their living room, opening her laptop. "I don't," she replied, and that was true. She did not take it personally. She took it seriously. On her screen, a document opened blank, except for a date at the top. She began to type. Not emotions, not interpretations. Facts, date, location, attendees, exact wording, tone, timing, patterns. She recorded Gloria's statement, the context in which it was delivered, the silence that followed, Santiago's lack of response. Each detail entered cleanly without commentary. It was not a diary, it was a record. Over the following weeks, the pattern continued. Gloria's comments became slightly more direct. Still controlled, still deniable. "I worry about wasted time. Women today focus on careers too long. Some things can't be delayed forever." Each statement was positioned carefully, never an accusation, always an observation. Peyton documented them all. Santiago remained consistent, supportive in language, absent in action. "Just ignore it," he would say. "It'll pass. It's not worth making a problem out of." But Peyton understood something Santiago did not. Problems did not disappear when ignored. They evolved. And evolution without oversight often led to consequences. Weeks turned into months. The narrative around her solidified quietly within the Reyes family. Peyton Hayes, the silent wife, the career woman, the one who hadn't contributed. No one said it directly. They didn't need to. By the time Gloria finally addressed the issue without layers, by the time the word Barren first appeared soft but unmistakable, it did not feel sudden. It felt prepared, engineered through repetition. Peyton recorded that too. Not because she intended to confront Gloria, not because she planned to argue, but because patterns once complete revealed something else. Intent. And intent, when proven, could not be dismissed as misunderstanding. What no one in the Reyes family understood, what Santiago never paused long enough to consider, was that Peyton was not enduring. She was building, quietly, precisely. And she had already begun to notice something else, something that did not align. Because while the narrative around her became louder, another silence had formed, this one around Santiago. And unlike the others, this silence did not feel empty. It felt deliberate. Silence, when repeated often enough, began to sound like intention. Peyton recognized the difference. In the months following Gloria's first unmasked remark, the conversations around her did not escalate. They refined. The language became cleaner, sharper, stripped of any softness that could be mistaken for kindness. What had once been implication was now positioning. And positioning, Peyton understood, always served a purpose. It was during this period that the subject of medical evaluation surfaced not as concern, but as expectation. Gloria introduced it over lunch one Sunday in a tone so composed it bordered on clinical. "There are excellent specialists in the city," she said, slicing her food with precise movements. "Women wait too long these days to understand what's limiting them." The word settled between them. Limiting. Peyton did not respond immediately. She noted the phrasing, not if there was an issue, not whether they should explore it together, but where the limitation existed. Santiago glanced at Peyton briefly, then back at his plate. "It wouldn't hurt to check," he added, his voice neutral. "Agreement without ownership." Peyton nodded once. Of course. She did not resist. Because resistance in environments like this often became evidence. The appointment was scheduled within the week. The clinic itself was quiet, efficient, and discreet. Neutral tones, soft lighting, conversations held behind closed doors, everything designed to minimize discomfort, at least on the surface. Peyton attended alone. Santiago had a conflict at work. He apologized briefly, promised to join the next appointment. There was no next appointment scheduled for him. The evaluation process was thorough. Blood work, imaging, consultations, questions asked in careful professional tones. Peyton answered all of them without hesitation. Her medical history was uncomplicated. Her health stable, her cycle regular, no indicators of dysfunction. When the results returned, they did so with the same clarity Peyton had expected. Normal. No abnormalities detected, no limitations. The doctor, a woman in her 40s with a measured, reassuring demeanor, reviewed the findings with her. "From what we can see," she said, "there's no reason you wouldn't be able to conceive." Peyton listened. "And the next step?" she asked. The doctor paused just briefly. "We would typically evaluate your partner as well," she said. "Fertility is shared." Shared. The word carried weight. Peyton nodded. "I'll discuss that with him." She left the clinic with a printed report in hand and a second document forming quietly in her mind. Data point, confirmed. That evening, she placed the report on the kitchen counter between herself and Santiago. He glanced at it but did not pick it up immediately. "What did they say?" he asked. Peyton removed her coat, setting it aside with deliberate care. "They didn't find anything." A pause. "That's good." Santiago said a small exhale following the words. Relief, but not curiosity. Peyton watched him. "The doctor recommended we both be evaluated." Santiago reached for the report, then flipping through the pages quickly, too quickly to read. "I'm sure it's just timing," he said. "These things don't always happen right away." It was a reasonable statement. It was also incomplete. Peyton did not push. Not because she agreed, but because she had already begun to understand the structure of his responses. Deflection, when consistent, became pattern, and patterns could be mapped. Days passed. The report remained on the counter for 2 days before Santiago moved it into a drawer. He did not schedule an appointment. He did not mention it again. Gloria, however, did. At the next family gathering, she approached Peyton with a glass of wine in hand and a smile that did not reach her eyes. "I heard you saw a specialist," she said. The information had traveled quickly. Peyton inclined her head. "Yes." And Gloria asked. The question was not casual. It was positioned. "No issues were found," Peyton replied. Gloria's smile held. "How?" "Fortunate," she said. A beat. And Santiago Peyton met her gaze. "He hasn't gone yet." Gloria's expression shifted just slightly. Not surprise, not concern. Calculation. "Well," she said, taking a slow sip of her wine, "men don't usually need to. These things tend to be straightforward." The statement was delivered lightly. Its meaning was not. Peyton recorded it later that night. Exact wording. Tone dismissive assured. Implication responsibility assigned. Over the following weeks, the pattern deepened. Santiago continued to avoid evaluation. Each time Peyton mentioned it, never aggressively, always neutrally, he responded with variations of the same reasoning. Work's been busy. I'll get to it. It's probably unnecessary. None of the statements were confrontational. None of them moved anything forward. Peyton adjusted. She stopped asking, not because the question was resolved, but because repetition without progress offered diminishing returns. Instead, she observed Santiago's schedule, his calls, the moments he stepped out of the room to answer his phone, the way certain topics shifted his posture, subtle but consistent. Avoidance, Peyton knew, often protected something. The question was what? At family dinners, the narrative around her solidified further. Gloria's comments became more pointed, still controlled, but less disguised. Some women prioritize the wrong things. Careers don't continue families. Time doesn't wait. Each statement landed in public spaces framed as general observations, but directed with precision. Guests responded with silence or polite agreement. No one contradicted her. Santiago remained quiet. He would occasionally place a hand on Peyton's back, a gesture that suggested support without substance. Peyton did not react, because reaction would have shifted the focus. And Peyton was no longer interested in defending herself within a narrative she did not create. She was interested in understanding the one that had been built around her. One evening, as she sat alone in their apartment reviewing her notes, she noticed something that had not been immediately obvious. The timing. Gloria's escalation had not been random. It had intensified after a specific point one Peyton had initially overlooked. The month Santiago first refused evaluation. Before that, the comments had been subtle. After that, they sharpened. Correlation did not confirm causation, but it suggested direction. Peyton opened a new document. Timeline. She began aligning events. Medical appointment. Santiago's deflection. Gloria's shift in language. Frequency of comments. Patterns in behavior. The structure began to form, not complete, but emerging. And within that structure, a space appeared, a gap. Because if Gloria's certainty had increased while evidence remained absent, then her confidence was not based on information provided publicly. It was based on something else, something she believed she already knew. Peyton leaned back slightly, eyes resting on the screen. Knowledge, when held by one party and not the other, created imbalance. But imbalance, when identified, could be corrected. She closed the document and reached for her phone. There was no urgency in her movements, no visible shift, only adjustment. Because Peyton Hayes did not confront incomplete information, she completed it. And somewhere within Santiago's silence, within the deliberate space he maintained, around a single simple action, there was something waiting to be uncovered. Not speculation, not assumption, but fact. And once found, it would not need to be argued. It would stand on its own. By the time Peyton stopped asking Santiago to schedule his evaluation, the silence between them had already taken on a new shape. It was no longer passive. It was structured. In their apartment, routines continued with practiced ease. Breakfast prepared without discussion. Evenings shared in parallel him on calls her at her desk. Conversations existed, but only in the spaces that did not require depth. Santiago believed the tension had eased. Peyton knew it had only shifted location, because when pressure stopped moving outward, it often moved inward, into systems, into records, into places less visible, but more revealing. 3 weeks after her final mention of the evaluation, Peyton noticed the first irregularity. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself. It appeared in the form of a notification brief easily dismissed. An email preview on Santiago's phone as it lit up on the kitchen counter. He had stepped away to take a call. The screen remained unlocked for just a moment longer than usual. Peyton did not reach for it immediately. She observed, Sender Lakeshore Reproductive Center. Subject line, follow-up results, and consultation options. The screen dimmed before the message could fully expand. Peyton returned her attention to the sink, rinsing a plate under steady water. She did not move toward the phone. She did not need to, because she had already seen enough. Data point, contradiction. Santiago had said he had not gone. The email suggested otherwise. That evening, she made no mention of it. She did not ask questions designed to provoke denial. Instead, she adjusted her approach. Access, Peyton understood, was rarely granted through confrontation. It was obtained through timing. Over the next few days, she paid closer attention not to what Santiago said, but to how he moved. His phone, once casually placed, now remained closer to him. Screen angled away. Notifications cleared more quickly. Small changes, subtle, but consistent. Behavior adapted when something required protection. Peyton documented the shift, not as accusation, but as pattern evolution. The opportunity came on a Thursday evening. Santiago had fallen asleep on the couch, his laptop still open, a legal brief half finished on the screen. His phone rested beside him, face down. Peyton stood in the doorway for a moment, watching. Not him, the environment. Stillness, when complete, created openings. She moved quietly, crossing the room without urgency. When she picked up the phone, she did so without hesitation. Hesitation created noise. The screen lit instantly. No passcode. Trust in some systems remained unchallenged. Peyton did not search randomly. She went directly to the email application. Search bar. Keyword Lakeshore. Results appeared immediately. Multiple threads. Not recent. Ongoing. She opened the most recent message first. Follow-up results and consultation options. The email was clinical in tone, structured, impersonal. Attached lab report. Peyton downloaded it. The file opened in seconds. She read it once, then again, not for understanding, but for confirmation. Diagnosis. Severe male factor infertility. Details followed. Sperm count critically low. Motility non-viable. Recommendation assisted reproductive options. The language was precise, undeniable. Santiago Reyes had been evaluated, and he had received the results weeks ago. Peyton closed the file. Her expression did not change, because what she had found was not unexpected. It was alignment. The narrative that had been constructed around her, the certainty, the escalation, Gloria's confidence, now had context. They had known, both of them. Santiago, Gloria. The silence had not been absence. It had been concealment. Peyton navigated through the rest of the email threads. Appointment confirmations. Follow-up discussions. One message stood out. From Santiago to the clinic. Please do not send physical mail to my home address. Email communication only. A request for control. For containment. Peyton exited the email application and opened the phone's file storage. Downloads. The lab report was there alongside earlier documents, initial test results, consultation summaries. She selected each file, transferring them quickly to her own secure cloud storage via a shared link she had prepared days earlier. Preparation, she believed, was not prediction. It was readiness. Once the files were transferred, she closed all applications, returning the phone to its original position. Screen down, angle unchanged. No disturbance. Santiago shifted slightly in his sleep but did not wake. Peyton stepped back, returning to her desk. She sat down and opened a new document. Title: Medical Evidence. She began to log. Date of discovery. Source: Santiago's personal device. Documents obtained. Findings summarized without interpretation. Facts. Always facts. The next morning, nothing in their routine changed. Santiago moved through breakfast with the same composed efficiency. Coffee poured, emails checked, a brief comment about his schedule. Peyton listened, observed. He did not mention the clinic. He did not mention the results. He asked casually, "How's your workload this week?" Peyton met his gaze briefly. "Structured," she replied. The word held more meaning than he understood. Later that week at another family dinner, Gloria's tone shifted again subtly but with new confidence. "I've been thinking," she said, addressing the table but directing her attention toward Peyton. "Some situations require creative solutions." The phrasing was deliberate. "Not everything has to follow the traditional path," she continued. "Families find ways to continue." Agreement murmured around the table. No one asked for clarification. Peyton noted the shift. Language moving away from blame, toward justification. That she recognized was progression. Because once a narrative moved from accusation to solution, it indicated something else. A plan. Gloria's eyes lingered on Peyton, measuring reaction. Peyton offered none. Not because she didn't understand, but because understanding did not require display. What Gloria saw was stillness. What she did not see was structure forming beneath it, because now Peyton had something she had not had before. Confirmation, not suspicion, not pattern, but documented fact. Santiago Reyes had known, and he had chosen silence. The implication extended beyond omission. It revealed alignment, with Gloria, with the narrative, with the decision to position Peyton as the source of a problem that did not belong to her. Peyton did not confront him that night. She did not reference the clinic. She did not ask why, because why was not a question that produced useful answers in systems built on control. Instead, she shifted focus from discovery to application, because evidence once obtained required context to become leverage. And leverage, Peyton knew, was not applied impulsively. It was placed precisely. Over the next several days, she began mapping connections. Timeline updated. Medical diagnosis date aligned with Gloria's behavioral shift. Santiago's communication patterns cross-referenced. Moments of deflection reevaluated. The structure sharpened. Not complete, but forming. And within that structure, a new question emerged. If Santiago's condition had been known and concealed, then Gloria's sudden acceptance of alternative solutions suggested something further. Something already in motion. Peyton sat at her desk late one evening, reviewing the documents again. The lab report remained unchanged. Objective, final. But around it, the behavior it had influenced continued to evolve. And evolution, when guided, rarely stopped at concealment. It moved toward replacement. Peyton closed the file slowly, because somewhere beyond the medical report, beyond the silence, beyond the narrative, there was something else being prepared. She had not seen it yet, but she could feel its outline. A gap in the timeline. A future event being positioned as inevitability. And when it arrived, it would not be presented as a question. It would be introduced as fact. Peyton leaned back slightly, her gaze steady. Because whatever was coming next, she would not meet it unprepared. The announcement did not arrive with hesitation. It arrived as certainty. 3 weeks after Peyton secured the lab reports from Santiago's phone, Gloria Reyes hosted another gathering larger than usual, more curated. The guest list extended beyond family to include business associates, longtime friends, and individuals whose presence signaled importance. The house was arranged accordingly. Lighting adjusted, catering elevated, seating intentional. Events like this, Peyton understood, were not spontaneous. They were staged. Santiago informed her of the dinner 2 days in advance. "My mother wants everyone there," he said, adjusting his cufflinks in the bedroom mirror. "It's something she's been planning." He did not elaborate. Peyton did not ask, because explanation in this household was often delivered publicly rather than privately. The evening unfolded with the usual structure. Guests arrived in measured waves, conversations layered over soft music, laughter placed carefully where it was expected. Peyton moved through the space with quiet awareness. She greeted when greeted, listened when spoken to, observed always. Gloria remained at the center, not moving quickly but directing attention without effort. Her presence shaped the room's rhythm when conversations paused, when they resumed when glasses were lifted. At precisely the midpoint of the evening, Gloria signaled for attention. It was subtle, a slight lift of her glass, a shift in posture. The room responded. Conversations softened. Heads turned. Santiago stepped closer to her side, his expression composed. Peyton stood several feet away near the edge of the room where observation was easiest. Gloria smiled. I want to share something with all of you. She began, her voice smooth, carrying easily across the room. A pause, calculated, not hesitant. As you know, family has always been at the heart of everything we've built. Agreement murmured softly. It defines our legacy, she continued. Our continuity. Her gaze moved across the room, briefly touching on familiar faces. Then, deliberately, it settled on Peyton. For some time we have faced challenges. The word was chosen carefully. Neutral, flexible. Difficulties that required us to think beyond the traditional. Another pause. Peyton noted the phrasing. Not uncertainty, not struggle, but adaptation. Gloria turned slightly, extending her hand toward a woman standing near the back of the room. Tonight, I want to introduce someone important. The woman stepped forward. Mid-20s, composed but not entirely at ease. Erin Cole. Peyton recognized her immediately. Not from personal interaction, those would come later, but from the quiet alignment already forming in her mind. Erin held the hand of a small boy, approximately 2 years old. Blonde hair, light eyes. Features that at first glance did not strongly resemble anyone in the Reyes family, but resemblance Peyton knew was rarely the foundation of belief. Narrative was. Gloria's smile deepened. This is Lucas. The name settled into the room with weight. My grandson. Silence followed. Not disbelief. Not yet. Processing. Then came the shift. Murmurs. Soft exclamations. Surprise transitioning quickly into acceptance. Because Gloria Reyes did not present uncertainty. She presented conclusions. Santiago placed a hand lightly on Erin's shoulder. A gesture of acknowledgement, of inclusion, not intimacy, but recognition. Peyton observed the distance between them. Measured, controlled. Erin's posture remained slightly rigid. Her smile appeared when expected, but faded quickly when attention moved elsewhere. The child Lucas looked around the room with quiet curiosity, unaware of the structure being built around him. Gloria continued. Life doesn't always follow the path we expect, she said. But what matters is that we find a way forward. Her eyes returned to Peyton. And that we don't let limitations define us. The word again, limitations, now placed within a new context. A solution had been introduced. The room adjusted. Guests approached Erin. Compliments offered, questions asked. How old is he? He's beautiful. Congratulations. Santiago accepted each statement with a controlled nod, his expression steady. Peyton did not move immediately. She allowed the room to reorganize itself, to accept, to settle. Because acceptance once formed became more difficult to disrupt. When she finally stepped forward, it was without urgency. Her gaze moved first to the child, Lucas. She observed him the same way she observed everything else. Details, physical traits, behavior. Then she looked at Erin. Their eyes met briefly. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them. Not familiarity, not alliance, but recognition. Erin looked away first. Peyton inclined her head slightly. Hello, she said. Erin nodded. Hi. Her voice was steady, but only just. Peyton did not ask questions. Not here, not now. Because this was not the space for truth. This was the space for presentation. And presentation, Peyton knew, was rarely where facts were revealed. Santiago approached then, positioning himself between Peyton and Erin, not overtly, but enough to shift the dynamic. Peyton, he said, his tone light, this is obviously unexpected. A small smile followed, as if the situation could be contained within that word. Unexpected. Peyton looked at him. Is it? She asked. Her voice remained calm, even. Santiago held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary. Then he exhaled softly. We'll talk later, he said. Not a question, a directive. Peyton nodded once. Of course. The conversation ended there. Not because it was resolved, but because it was postponed. and postponement in this environment often functioned as control. The evening continued. The narrative solidified. Lucas was introduced repeatedly. Grandson, family, legacy. Each repetition strengthened the structure. Peyton moved through the remainder of the event without disruption. She observed interactions, tracked timelines, noted inconsistencies. Aaron's responses when asked about dates. Santiago's proximity close enough to imply connection, distant enough to avoid detail. Gloria's confidence unwavering, as if no contradiction could exist. By the time the final guests departed, the story had been fully installed. Not questioned, not challenged, accepted. Later that night, in the privacy of their apartment, Santiago attempted explanation. It's complicated. He began loosening his tie, his movements slower now. Peyton stood near the window, looking out over the city. Then explain it, simply, she said. Santiago hesitated, a fraction of a second. Then, it happened before we were married, he said. I didn't know at the time. The statement was structured, careful, positioned to minimize. Peyton turned slightly, and now she asked. I found out recently, he replied. My mother thought it was important to acknowledge it. A pause. To include him. Include. Another word chosen for its neutrality. Peyton held his gaze. And the timeline, she asked. Santiago's expression tightened just briefly. It's not exact, he said. These things rarely are. Deflection. Peyton noted it. She did not challenge it, not because she believed him, but because belief was not required. Evidence would serve better. She nodded once. I understand, she said. Santiago exhaled relief, passing quickly across his face. Good, he said. I didn't want this to become a problem. Peyton turned back to the window. It won't, she replied. And that was true, because Peyton Hayes did not create problems. She identified them, defined them, and when necessary, resolved them. Behind her, Santiago moved through the apartment with quiet efficiency, unaware that the structure he believed he had secured had already begun to fracture. Not visibly, not yet. But within Peyton's records, within her timelines, within the alignment of facts that no longer supported the narrative presented, the story had already changed. Lucas Bennett, introduced as certainty, accepted as truth. But truth, Peyton knew, required verification. And verification was only a matter of time. Peyton did not look for Aaron Cole immediately. Timing, she understood, determined whether information revealed itself or concealed itself further. In the days following the announcement, the Reyes family adjusted quickly to their new narrative. Lucas Bennett became a fixed presence in conversation. His name appeared naturally, as if it had always belonged there. Gloria spoke of him often, not with affection alone, but with ownership. My grandson prefers apples over sweets, she would say. He has Santiago's calm. We're arranging a better school for him. Each statement reinforced legitimacy. Each repetition made questioning less likely. Santiago adapted as well. He integrated Lucas into his language with practiced ease. Not overly emotional, not distant, balanced, measured. But Peyton noticed the gaps. He never spoke about the past, never offered details that could be tested. Everything remained in the present. That to Peyton was not oversight. It was control, so she waited. She observed how often Aaron appeared, which events she attended, who she spoke to, and more importantly, when she was alone. The opportunity came 10 days later, a weekday afternoon. Location: a small cafe on the north side of the city, far from the Reyes family's usual circles. Peyton had followed the pattern quietly. Aaron brought Lucas there twice a week. Same time, same table near the window. Routine, Peyton knew, created predictability, and predictability created access. Peyton arrived early. She chose a seat that allowed clear visibility without intrusion. Ordered coffee, opened her laptop. From a distance, she appeared occupied, available, non-threatening. When Aaron entered, she carried Lucas on her hip, a diaper bag slung over her shoulder. Her movements were efficient but slightly tense, as if she were always aware of being observed. She settled into her usual seat. Lucas was placed in a chair with quiet instructions. A snack, a toy, distraction. Peyton waited. Not long enough to appear deliberate, not short enough to seem impulsive. Then she closed her laptop, lifted her coffee, and approached. "Is this seat taken?" she asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from Aaron. Aaron looked up. Recognition came instantly. Her posture stiffened. "No," she said after a brief pause. Peyton sat. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable, not yet. Just unstructured. Peyton allowed it to remain that way for a few seconds before speaking. "You chose a place far from their usual routes," she said. Aaron blinked. "What, the Reyes family?" Peyton clarified. "They don't come here." It was not a question. Aaron's fingers tightened slightly around her cup. "I like it here," she said. Peyton nodded. "It's quiet." Another pause. Lucas tapped his toy against the table, unaware of the tension shaping the air around him. Peyton's gaze shifted briefly to him. "He's observant," she said. Aaron followed her gaze, her expression softening just slightly. "He's too," she replied. "Everything is interesting at that age." Peyton returned her attention to Aaron. "Yes," she said, "especially patterns." The word settled between them. Aaron's shoulders tensed again. "What do you want?" she asked. Direct, finally. Peyton appreciated that. "Clarity," she said. Aaron let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. "You should talk to Santiago," she said. "I did," Peyton replied, "and he prefers simplified explanations." Aaron looked down at her cup. "That sounds like him," she murmured. There was something in her tone, not loyalty, not resentment, something closer to resignation. Peyton leaned back slightly. "I'm not here to argue," she said, "and I'm not here to threaten you." Aaron looked up again. "Then why are you here?" Peyton met her gaze. "Because you're part of something that's being presented as fact," she said, "and I need to understand what's real." Aaron's jaw tightened. "You think I'm lying?" Peyton shook her head. "I think you're involved," she said. "Those are different things." Silence returned, this time heavier. Aaron glanced toward Lucas, who was now focused on stacking small plastic blocks. Her voice when she spoke again was lower. "You don't understand," she said. Peyton did not interrupt. Understanding, she knew, often required space. "I didn't plan any of this," Aaron continued. "I didn't ask for it." Her hands moved slightly as she spoke, restless. "They came to me," she added. "They," Peyton asked. Aaron hesitated. "Then his mother," she said. "Gloria." The name settled with weight. Peyton's expression did not change. When she asked, Aaron swallowed. "About 6 months ago," she said. 6 months. Peyton noted the timing immediately. That was after the diagnosis. The pieces began to align. "What did she want?" Peyton asked. Aaron looked down again. "At first it was just conversations," she said. "Questions about my situation, about Lucas. And then she offered help," Aaron said. "Financial support, stability." A pause. "In exchange for," what Aaron's fingers tightened, "for letting them be part of his life," she said. Part of his life. Not fatherhood, not truth, just involvement. Peyton considered the wording. "Did Santiago know?" she asked. Aaron gave a small, bitter smile. "He was there," she said. "Not always speaking, but always present." Confirmation. Peyton absorbed it without reaction. "And the claim?" she asked. That Lucas's, as Aaron's silence stretched longer this time. Lucas dropped a block. It clattered softly against the table. Aaron picked it up, placing it back in his hand. When she spoke, her voice was almost steady. "They said it would be easier," she said. "For who?" Peyton asked. "For everyone," Aaron replied. The phrase echoed. Familiar, constructed. Peyton leaned forward slightly. "Is it true?" she asked. The question was simple, direct, no framing. Aaron's eyes met hers, and for the first time there was no deflection. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but absolute. Peyton held her gaze for a moment longer, not for confirmation, but for completeness. There was no hesitation, no correction, just truth, finally unfiltered. Peyton nodded once. Thank you, she said. Erin blinked, caught off guard. That's it, she asked. For now, Peyton replied. Erin's confusion was visible. You're not going to do anything, she asked. Peyton stood gathering her things. I already am, she said. Erin watched her. What does that mean? Peyton paused. Not long, just enough. It means I don't need to argue with what isn't real, she said. And I don't need anyone to admit what I can prove. Erin's expression shifted something between relief and fear. Peyton looked at Lucas once more. He was focused on his blocks again, unaware of the structure that had just collapsed around him. Take care of him, Peyton said. Erin nodded slowly. I am, she replied. Peyton believed her. Because whatever Erin's role had been, it was not rooted in malice. It was survival. And survival often accepted terms it didn't create. As Peyton stepped out of the cafe, the air outside felt unchanged. Traffic moved. People passed. The city continued without interruption. But within Peyton's framework, something had solidified. Not suspicion, not theory, but confirmation. Lucas Bennett was not Santiago Reyes' son. The narrative had been constructed deliberately, supported financially, maintained socially, and now documented. Peyton walked without urgency, her steps even. Because truth once confirmed did not require immediate action. It required placement. And Peyton Hayes had always known placement determined outcome. By the time Peyton returned from the cafe, the outline of what she was dealing with had already transitioned from uncertainty into structure, and from structure into something closer to a case. The conversation with Erin had not surprised her in content, but it had completed a missing layer, intent confirmed through admission rather than inference. Still, Peyton did not allow that confirmation to accelerate her pace. Speed, she knew, often introduced error, and error weakened credibility. What she needed now was not more explanation, but corroboration evidence that would not depend on memory tone or interpretation. It would need to stand independently. That evening, Santiago returned home later than usual. His movements were slightly more deliberate, as though fatigue had begun to settle into his posture, but his demeanor remained composed. He greeted Peyton with the same practiced normalcy, placed his keys in their usual spot, and asked a brief question about her day. Peyton answered in the same tone she always used, measured, neutral, complete without elaboration. Nothing in her voice suggested that anything had changed, and that was intentional. Because at this stage, concealment was not something she needed to challenge. It was something she needed to observe, uninterrupted. After dinner, while Santiago moved into his office space to review documents, Peyton remained in the living room with her laptop open. What she began assembling that night would not resemble the informal logs she had kept before. Those had been for pattern recognition. This would be for substantiation. She accessed the shared financial accounts first. The Reyes family operated with a layered financial structure. Santiago maintained personal accounts, but there were also joint accounts, ostensibly for household management, that Peyton had full legal access to. It was within these that she expected to find the least protected activity, not because Santiago was careless, but because familiarity often reduced perceived risk. She began by filtering transactions over the past 6 months. Time frame aligned with Erin's statement. Patterns once again began to surface. At first glance, the transactions appeared routine monthly expenditures, categorized payments transfers that could easily be explained as operational or personal. However, Peyton did not rely on categories. She relied on consistency. She isolated a recurring transfer, same recipient, regular intervals, amounts that were not identical but close enough to suggest calculation rather than coincidence. Recipient name E. Cole. Peyton did not react outwardly. She simply expanded the transaction history. There were 12 transfers in total. The earliest dated just under 6 months ago. The most recent 3 days prior. Each transfer was labeled differently. Consulting, support, reimbursement. The variation was intentional, designed to avoid repetition. But repetition existed in the timing. Every 2 weeks, without fail. Peyton began documenting each entry. Date, amount, label, account origin. She cross-referenced the dates with her existing timeline. the one she had constructed from Gloria's behavioral shifts, Santiago's communications, and now Aaron's statement. The alignment was exact. The first transfer occurred within 48 hours of Santiago receiving his fertility diagnosis. That detail, while not visible within the transaction itself, now held significance within the broader structure Peyton had built, because it suggested not only reaction, but coordination. Peyton opened a new spreadsheet. This one was formatted differently. Not narrative, not observational, but evidentiary. Columns were labeled with precision. Transaction ID, date, amount, declared purpose, actual context, pending confirmation. She populated each row, carefully verifying each entry twice before moving on. There was no urgency in her movements, only accuracy. Once the transaction data had been compiled, Peyton shifted her focus toward external confirmation. Bank records alone could suggest behavior, but they required context to establish intent. And intent, when demonstrated through multiple independent sources, became significantly harder to dispute. She accessed the bank's detailed transfer logs, requesting full metadata for each transaction. Timestamps, authorization methods, IP addresses where available. Some of the information required additional authentication, which she completed without hesitation. As a compliance analyst, she was accustomed to navigating systems designed to obscure as much as they revealed. Within minutes, additional details populated the records. Several transfers had been initiated from Santiago's personal device, others from his office network. One notably had been scheduled in advance, automated. That indicated planning, not reaction. Peyton documented each variation, because variation, when analyzed correctly, revealed decision-making patterns. She leaned back slightly, reviewing the structure she had assembled. At this stage, the financial component of the situation had moved beyond suspicion. It now demonstrated a consistent, deliberate flow of money from Santiago to Aaron, beginning immediately after his diagnosis and continuing uninterrupted. But Peyton understood that financial records alone would not complete the picture. They needed to be connected to communication, to agreement, to knowledge. She opened her secure storage and reviewed the files she had extracted from Santiago's phone. Emails from Lakeshore Reproductive Center, attached lab reports, appointment confirmations. She created a parallel timeline. Medical diagnosis, first transfer, subsequent payments. Each element aligned without contradiction. The structure was no longer forming. It was complete. Still, Peyton did not stop there, because one element remained Gloria. While Santiago's involvement was now documented, Gloria's role existed primarily within conversation implication and Aaron's statement. To bring that into the same evidentiary framework, Peyton needed something more tangible. She reviewed her earlier logs, recorded statements from family dinners, notations of Gloria's language shifts. While these provided context, they lacked verifiability. That would need to change. Peyton closed her laptop briefly and sat in stillness, allowing the information to settle into its proper configuration. There was no satisfaction in what she had found, no sense of victory, only clarity. And clarity, she knew, required discipline. Because acting too early would reduce impact. Acting too late would reduce control. What she needed was precision. Behind her, Santiago's voice carried faintly from the other room as he spoke on a call. His tone was steady, professional, unaffected by the reality that now existed in full detail within Peyton's records. That more than anything reinforced what Peyton already understood. He did not believe he was at risk, not yet. Peyton reopened her laptop and began drafting a summary document. Not for confrontation, not for explanation, but for legal positioning. The language was formal, objective, each section supported by documented evidence. No assumptions, no emotional framing, just fact layered upon fact, arranged in a way that would require acknowledgement once presented in the appropriate setting. As she typed, one final observation settled into place. The Reyes family had not simply constructed a false narrative. They had financed it, sustained it, integrated it into their social and professional identity. And in doing so, they had created something far more vulnerable than they realized. Because systems built on concealment often failed not from external attack, but from internal contradiction. Peyton saved the document, encrypting it alongside her other files. Then she closed her laptop. Across the apartment, Santiago ended his call and stepped into the living room, his expression unchanged. "Long day," he said. Peyton looked at him. "Yes," she replied. And for the first time, the word carried a weight he could not yet perceive. Because while his day had followed a familiar structure, hers had redefined the outcome of everything that would come next. In the weeks that followed, Peyton did not change her behavior in any way that could be measured from the outside. She continued to attend family dinners when expected, maintained her routines with quiet consistency, and responded to Santiago with the same composed neutrality that had always defined her presence in the Reyes household. Nothing in her tone, posture, or timing suggested that anything had shifted. But internally, the structure she had built was no longer in development. It was operational. What remained now was not discovery, but completion. Because while the financial records and medical documentation had already established a clear foundation, Peyton understood that systems like the one Gloria had constructed did not rely on a single layer of concealment. They relied on reinforcement, on agreement, on repeated coordination, on conversations that aligned private knowledge with public presentation. And conversations, unlike transactions, required capture. The opportunity presented itself not through chance, but through predictability. Gloria hosted regularly. Smaller gatherings more controlled than the public announcement, but no less intentional. These were the spaces where strategy often replaced performance, where tone shifted slightly, where language became more precise, and where the illusion of privacy encouraged disclosure. Peyton selected her moment carefully. It was a Sunday afternoon, quieter than most. The guest list was limited to immediate family Gloria, Santiago, and Peyton. Lucas was present along with Erin, though her role remained peripheral, positioned more as an accessory to the child than as an equal participant in conversation. The house itself carried its usual stillness, polished surfaces reflecting soft light, every detail arranged to maintain control over both appearance and atmosphere. Peyton arrived early. Not unusually so, but with intention. She moved through the space with familiarity, greeting Gloria, with a brief, composed acknowledgement before placing her belongings in the sitting room. Her phone, as always, remained with her, but this time, it served a purpose beyond communication. Preparation, she had learned, was most effective when invisible. The device rested in her bag, its recording function already activated, capturing audio through a discrete application designed for continuous operation without visible indication. It was not illegal. In this state, one-party consent was sufficient. Peyton did not rely on assumptions. She verified jurisdiction before acting. The afternoon began without tension. Gloria spoke of routine matters, business developments, social obligations, minor complaints framed as observations. Santiago responded with measured engagement, reinforcing his role as both son and professional, careful not to disrupt the balance his mother maintained. Lucas played quietly on the floor. Erin remained attentive but silent unless addressed. Peyton observed, waited, because conversations when forced often closed rather than opened. Time, however, had a different effect. As the afternoon progressed, structure loosened slightly. Gloria's tone softened not in warmth but in control. She shifted from public-facing language into something more candid, more reflective of her internal reasoning. It began, as many things did, with a statement framed as philosophy. "Families have to adapt," Gloria said, seated in her usual chair, a glass of wine balanced carefully in her hand. "The world doesn't always cooperate with expectations." Santiago nodded. "That's true," he said. Peyton remained still. Gloria's gaze moved toward her, measuring as always. "Some people," Gloria continued, "don't understand that waiting for things to happen naturally can be inefficient." The word choice was deliberate. Efficiency in Gloria's world was not preference. It was principle. Peyton inclined her head slightly. And alternatives, she asked. The question was neutral, open. Gloria smiled faintly. Alternatives are solutions, she said. They require a willingness to think beyond limitations. Limitations, again. The narrative remained consistent. Santiago shifted slightly in his seat. We've already addressed that he said his tone controlled, but edged with something Peyton recognized as caution. Gloria dismissed the concern with a small gesture. There's no harm in acknowledging reality, she replied. Then, after a pause, we knew what the situation was. The words entered the space without emphasis, but their meaning carried. Peyton did not react outwardly. She allowed the statement to settle. Santiago exhaled slowly. Mother, he said. But Gloria continued. We had information, she said. We made decisions based on it. The phrasing was clear. Ownership, intent, coordination. Peyton's gaze remained steady. What information, she asked. The question was simple, unforced. Gloria looked at her. For a moment there was something almost resembling amusement in her expression. Santiago's condition, she said. The word condition replaced diagnosis, but the meaning was identical. Santiago leaned forward slightly. That's not necessary, he said. Gloria ignored him. It was confirmed, she continued. We understood what we were dealing with. Peyton noted each word, internally, precisely. And Aaron, Peyton asked. Gloria's smile returned. She was suitable, she said. The child already existed. The circumstances were manageable. Peyton repeated the word silently. Santiago stood then, moving toward the window, his posture tightening. This isn't a conversation we need to have, he said. Gloria's tone remained unchanged. It's already been resolved, she replied. There's no conflict. Peyton understood then, not just the structure of the plan, but the belief behind it. Gloria did not see what they had done as deception. She saw it as correction, as optimization, a solution to a problem that in her mind justified the method. Peyton leaned back slightly. And the claim, she asked, that Lucas is Santiago's Gloria, met her gaze directly. That is what the family accepts, she said. Not truth, acceptance, defined as sufficient. Peyton allowed a brief silence. Then, and if it isn't accurate, she asked. Gloria's expression did not change. Accuracy is less important than stability, she replied. There it was, not just admission, but philosophy. Santiago turned back toward them, his expression controlled but strained. That's enough, he said. Peyton looked at him. He believed he was containing the situation. He did not yet understand that it had already been documented. Completely. Every statement, every confirmation, every alignment of intent. Peyton nodded once. Yes, she said, it is. The conversation ended there. Not because it had been resolved, but because it no longer needed to continue. What Peyton required had already been obtained. The remainder of the afternoon passed without further escalation. Gloria returned to safer topics. Santiago maintained distance. Aaron avoided eye contact entirely. The structure reassembled itself. But it was no longer intact, because within Peyton's bag, the recording continued until the moment she left the house. That evening, in the quiet of her apartment, she transferred the file to her secure system. She listened to it once, not for understanding, but for verification. The audio was clear, uninterrupted, legally admissible. She labeled the file carefully. Date, location, participants, summary of key statements. Then she added it to her case file. Complete. Now the structure contained medical evidence, financial records, direct testimony, and recorded admission, each layer reinforcing the next, each element independent yet aligned. Peyton closed her laptop slowly, because at this point there was nothing left to uncover, only something left to decide, when and how. And Peyton Hayes had always understood timing was not about opportunity. It was about control. Once the recording had been secured and verified, Peyton allowed herself a single evening without adding anything further to her files. It was not rest in the conventional sense, nor was it hesitation. It was calibration. Because at this stage, the difference between action and timing would determine whether everything she had gathered would simply exist or carry consequence. The next morning, she resumed. Her approach shifted slightly, not in intent but in scope. Up to this point, Peyton had focused on establishing truth within the narrative constructed by the Reyes family. Now, she needed to isolate that truth into something indisputable in a legal framework, something that would not rely on interpretation, but on verification across independent systems. The DNA test would serve that purpose, not as suspicion, but as confirmation layered over admission. Peyton began by identifying the appropriate facility. It could not be connected to Lakeshore Reproductive Center or any network that might overlap with Santiago's prior records. Independence was critical. She selected a private laboratory known for court-admissible paternity testing, one that required strict chain-of-custody documentation and provided certified results. She scheduled the appointment under her own name. No connection to the Reyes family. No shared billing. No digital trail that could be easily traced back to Santiago or Gloria. Once the appointment was confirmed, she mapped the next step. Sample collection. For Santiago, access was straightforward. For Lucas, it required precision. Peyton did not intend to involve Aaron directly, not because Aaron would refuse, but because consent once documented could be reframed, questioned, or used to introduce unnecessary complexity. What Peyton needed was uncontested methodology. Legality once again was verified. In this jurisdiction, non-invasive DNA collection from discarded materials was permissible if obtained without trespass or coercion. Peyton documented the statute. Then she proceeded. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Gloria hosted another small gathering 2 days later, less formal than previous events, but still structured enough to ensure predictability. Lucas was present as always, and as the evening progressed, he moved freely between spaces, leaving behind the small, ordinary traces that children inevitably did. A cup, a napkin, a strand of hair caught briefly in the fabric of a chair. Peyton did not act immediately. She waited until the environment shifted, until attention moved elsewhere, until conversations deepened and fragmented, creating small pockets of privacy within the larger space. Then, without interruption to her outward behavior, she collected what she needed. A used plastic cup Lucas had been drinking from. A napkin he had handled repeatedly. Each item was placed discreetly into a sealed evidence bag she had prepared in advance. No one noticed. Because Peyton did not move like someone doing something unusual. She moved like someone existing within expectation. Santiago's sample required even less effort. Later that night, back in their apartment, she collected a strand of his hair from his comb, placing it into a separate sealed container. Each sample was labeled immediately. Date, time, source, no assumptions, no shortcuts. Chain of custody began at the moment of collection. The following morning, Peyton delivered the samples to the laboratory in person. She completed the intake process with quiet efficiency, providing identification signing documentation, and ensuring that each step adhered strictly to procedural requirements. The technician professional and neutral confirmed receipt. Results will take approximately 5 to 7 business days, she said. Peyton nodded. That's fine. Waiting, she knew, was not passive. It was part of the process. During those days, Peyton did not revisit the case file unnecessarily. She did not re-listen to recordings or re-examine data she had already verified. Redundancy at this stage offered no additional value. Instead, she observed. Santiago's behavior remained consistent, controlled, predictable. If anything, he appeared more at ease, as though the narrative surrounding Lucas had stabilized to a point where it no longer required active maintenance. Gloria, on the other hand, became more expansive in her language. She spoke of Lucas openly integrating him into discussions about the family's future, referencing long-term plans, educational pathways, even inheritance structures, each statement reinforcing the permanence of what had been introduced. Peyton noted the shift. Not because it surprised her, but because it confirmed something critical. They believed the structure was secure. That belief would matter later. On the 6th day, the laboratory contacted her. The message was brief. Results ready for collection. Peyton scheduled the earliest available time. The lab was quiet when she arrived, its interior designed for discretion rather than comfort. She signed the final release forms and was handed a sealed envelope containing the official report. She did not open it immediately. Instead, she placed it into her bag and left the building. Only once she returned to her car parked in a shaded section of the lot did she allow herself to review it. She broke the seal carefully. The document inside was structured, clinical, precise. Case identification number, sample descriptions, testing methodology, then results. Probability of paternity 0%. Santiago Reyes was not the biological father of Lucas Bennett. The statement was clear, unambiguous. Peyton read it once. Then again, not because she doubted it, but because verification for her was never singular. She placed the document back into the envelope and sat in stillness for a moment. There was no surge of emotion, no sense of revelation, because what the test confirmed had already been established through other means. What it provided was something different: finality, legal certainty, the kind that did not rely on testimony or interpretation. The kind that, once introduced into the appropriate setting, would not be dismissed. That evening, Peyton scanned the report, creating encrypted digital copies and storing them alongside her existing files. She also prepared a secondary verification request, sending a portion of the remaining sample to an independent laboratory for confirmation. Redundancy, when executed properly, eliminated dispute. She then updated her case summary. Section DNA evidence. Findings inserted. Cross-referenced with existing timeline. Alignment confirmed. At this point, the structure was no longer a case in development. It was complete. Medical records established Santiago's condition. Financial records demonstrated coordinated payments. Audio recordings confirmed intent and admission. DNA testing provided indisputable biological evidence. Each element supported the others. Each element stood independently. Together, they formed something that could not be reframed as misunderstanding. Peyton closed the document and leaned back slightly, her gaze steady. Because now the only remaining variable was timing. Not whether to act, but when and in what setting. Because the Reyes family had chosen to construct their narrative publicly. They had introduced Lucas not in private, but in front of witnesses. They had reinforced the claim, repeatedly embedding it into their social and professional identity. Which meant the correction would not occur in isolation. It would occur in the same space where the narrative had been built. Public, structured, unavoidable. Peyton stood and moved toward the window, looking out over the city as evening settled in. Lights flickered on across buildings, each one containing its own patterns, its own systems, its own concealed truths. She understood something then with complete clarity. This was no longer about proving anything to Santiago or to Gloria. It was about presenting truth in a way that required acknowledgement from everyone who had accepted the lie. And Peyton Hayes had never needed to raise her voice to do that. She only needed to choose the moment when silence would no longer protect them. By the time the second laboratory returned its confirmation, Peyton had already anticipated the outcome, with a level of certainty that did not require emotional reinforcement. The result was identical, zero probability, no biological link, no ambiguity left to reinterpret. The redundancy did not change the truth. It fortified it. What changed, however, was Peyton's positioning. Until now, she had been operating as an observer who gathered aligned and secured information. With the final verification in place, she transitioned into something else entirely, someone preparing to act within a formal system that required structured timing and strategic clarity. She did not begin with confrontation. She began with representation. The attorney she selected, Claire Donovan, did not come from the Reyes family's network or any adjacent circle that might introduce bias or conflict. Claire's practice focused on complex financial disputes and high-conflict divorce litigation areas that demanded precision and restraint rather than theatrics. Peyton scheduled the consultation under her own name, using a private channel that would not intersect with shared communication lines. The meeting took place in a discreet office on the 32nd floor of a building that overlooked the river. The space itself reflected Claire's approach, minimal structured, with nothing unnecessary to distract from the work being done. Claire Donovan did not speak immediately when Peyton finished her initial summary. She reviewed, document by document, page by page. Her expression remained neutral, but her attention was exacting. She paused occasionally, not to question, but to note marking sections with small, precise annotations. Peyton did not fill the silence. She understood its function. When Claire finally looked up, her tone was measured. "You've done most of the work already," she said. It was not praise, it was assessment. Peyton inclined her head slightly. "I wanted the structure complete before involving counsel," she replied. Claire nodded. "That's clear." She closed the file briefly, her fingers resting on the cover. "What you have here," she continued, "is not just a misrepresentation within a family dynamic. It intersects with financial misconduct, potential fraud, and reputational exposure, especially given the Reyes Group's public positioning." Peyton listened. "Your objective?" Claire asked. The question was direct. Not what happened, not how it felt, but what outcome was intended. Peyton considered it, not because she was uncertain, but because articulation required precision. "Separation," she said. "Legally structured. No dispute over facts." Claire held her gaze. "And the rest, the rest." Peyton replied, "Should follow from the evidence." Claire studied her for a moment longer. Then she nodded once. "That's efficient," she said. The meeting shifted then from evaluation to planning. Claire outlined the process with clarity. Filing for divorce, securing financial disclosures, freezing relevant accounts where necessary, introducing evidence at the appropriate stage, not prematurely, not reactively. "Timing will matter," Claire said. "If this is introduced correctly, it won't just resolve your position. It will limit their ability to respond." Peyton understood. Not escalation, containment. They discussed the Reyes Group briefly, not in depth, but enough to establish potential exposure points. If internal investigations were triggered, especially regarding financial transfers, Gloria's position could be compromised. Not immediately, but structurally. Claire did not speculate beyond what could be supported. Neither did Peyton. By the end of the meeting, a framework had been established. Legal, sequential, controlled. Peyton left the office with no visible change in her expression, but with a shift that could not be undone. She was no longer preparing. She was positioned. Over the following days, she executed the initial steps without deviation. A separate financial account was established under her sole name. Funds legally accessible to her were transferred in accordance with marital asset regulations. Not excessive, not concealed, documented, transparent. Claire filed preliminary paperwork discreetly, ensuring that once formal notice was served, it would be accompanied by sufficient structure to prevent delay or manipulation. Peyton did not inform Santiago. Not yet. Because information once released altered behavior, and behavior once altered became less reliable as evidence. At home, nothing changed. Santiago continued his routines. Evenings remained structured around work and controlled conversation. His tone toward Peyton carried no suspicion, no indication that he sensed the shift that had already occurred beneath the surface. If anything, he appeared increasingly comfortable. The narrative surrounding Lucas had stabilized fully. Gloria spoke of the child openly now, even within professional settings. Invitations were extended that included him. References were made in conversations that extended beyond the family. Integration was complete. Peyton observed it all. Because the broader the acceptance, the greater the impact when correction occurred. One evening, as they sat across from each other at the dining table, Santiago spoke casually about an upcoming event. "My mother is hosting another dinner next week," Maurice said. "Bigger this time. Some of the board members will be there." Peyton looked up. The information settled into place immediately. Public, professional, witnesses beyond family. "What's the occasion?" she asked. Santiago shrugged slightly. "Just formalizing things," he said. "She wants to make sure everyone is aligned." Aligned. The word carried more weight than he intended. Peyton nodded once. "I'll be there," she said. Santiago smiled faintly, relieved by the absence of resistance. "Good," he replied. "It's important, yes," Peyton thought. It would be. That night, she updated her timeline. Event, Reyes dinner. Attendees, family board members, extended network. Purpose, public reinforcement of narrative. She added a notation. Opportunity. Because the setting Gloria had chosen to solidify her version of reality would serve equally well to dismantle it. Peyton did not rush toward that moment. She prepared for it. Documents were organized into physical copies. Not excessive, just enough. DNA reports, transaction summaries. Selected excerpts from recorded conversations, transcribed and timestamped. Each piece was formatted for clarity, not volume. Because overwhelming an audience diluted impact. Precision amplified it. Claire reviewed the materials remotely, offering minor adjustments, phrasing, sequencing emphasis. Nothing changed the substance, only its presentation. On the day of the event, Peyton dressed as she always did for such occasions, elegant, understated, aligned with expectation. Nothing in her appearance suggested deviation, because deviation would have drawn attention too early. When she arrived at the Reyes home, the atmosphere was already elevated beyond previous gatherings. The presence of unfamiliar faces, board members, investors, individuals whose decisions influenced the company's direction, shifted the dynamic. This was no longer just family. It was structure. Gloria moved through the room with visible confidence, her authority extending seamlessly from personal domain into professional influence. Santiago remained close, reinforcing alignment. Lucas was present, introduced again, accepted again, Peyton observed, waited, because the moment had not yet arrived. But it would. Not through interruption, not through escalation, but through placement. And when it came, it would not require her to raise her voice, only to present what had already been proven. The evening Gloria had orchestrated was not simply a dinner. It was a consolidation. From the moment guests began arriving, it was clear that the gathering had been structured with intention that extended beyond family ritual. The guest list, the seating arrangements, even the pacing of the evening, all reflected a level of coordination designed to align perception across multiple layers, social, professional, and reputational. Members of the Reyes Group board were present along with senior executives, long-standing partners, and a select group of individuals whose influence did not require titles to be understood. Conversations were measured. Laughter existed, but it carried an undertone of awareness. This was not a casual environment. This was positioning. Peyton entered the space without deviation from expectation. Her appearance was composed, her posture aligned with the quiet presence she had always maintained. No one looked at her twice, and that she understood was an advantage. Visibility in moments like this was not about being seen. It was about being overlooked until it mattered. Gloria moved through the room with controlled authority, acknowledging each guest with calibrated attention. Her voice carried just enough to guide conversations without dominating them. Santiago remained close to her, reinforcing the image of unity, of stability, of continuity. Lucas was introduced early in the evening, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same practiced certainty Gloria had used before. "This is my grandson," she said, her tone smooth assured. "He will be part of everything we continue to build." The phrasing was deliberate, not just family, but future. Peyton watched the reactions. There were no objections, only acceptance, because Gloria did not present information as something to be evaluated. She presented it as something already decided. Erin stood nearby, her posture composed but restrained. She spoke when spoken to, answered questions with careful brevity, and avoided elaboration. Her role remained consistent, present, but not central. Santiago engaged with guests in measured intervals, reinforcing relationships, maintaining appearances. Nothing in his behavior suggested tension. If anything, he appeared settled. That, Peyton noted, was the final confirmation she needed. They believed the structure was complete. The evening progressed with deliberate pacing. Drinks were served, conversations deepened. Business topics emerged naturally, interwoven with personal narratives. Gloria allowed the room to reach a point of cohesion before shifting its focus. When she finally called for attention, it was subtle. A slight lift of her glass. A pause in her movement. The room responded. Conversations quieted. Eyes turned. Gloria stood at the center, her posture composed, her expression controlled. "I want to thank all of you for being here." She began, her voice steady, carrying without strain. "For your continued trust, not only in our company, but in our family." A brief pause. "In recent months, we have navigated challenges that required us to think carefully about the future, about continuity, about leadership, about legacy." Her gaze moved across the room, settling momentarily on key individuals. "We have addressed those challenges," she continued, "and we have done so in a way that ensures stability moving forward." The word again, stability. It echoed her earlier statement. Peyton remained still, because she understood what Gloria was doing. She was not merely reaffirming Lucas's place within the family. She was integrating him into the narrative of the company, publicly, formally. And in doing so, she was binding personal fabrication to professional structure. That decision carried risk, not because it was visible, but because it expanded the consequences of being wrong. Gloria extended her hand slightly toward Lucas, who stood beside Erin. "This," she said, "is part of that future." There was a moment, brief but present, where the room absorbed the implication. Then came the response. Nods. Murmured agreement. Acceptance reinforced once again. Peyton allowed the silence that followed to stretch just long enough. Then she moved. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a level of clarity that shifted the room without raising her voice. "May I?" she said. Her tone was even, controlled, but it carried, because it was unexpected. Gloria turned toward her. For a fraction of a second, there was hesitation, not uncertainty, but recalibration. Then she smiled. "Of course, Peyton," she said. The room adjusted. Attention shifted. Peyton stepped forward, her posture unchanged, her expression neutral. She did not rush. She did not look at Santiago. She did not look at Erin. She looked at Gloria, then at the room. What she held in her hand was not a stack of documents, not an overwhelming display, just a single folder, structured, contained. "This won't take long," Peyton said. Her voice remained calm, measured. "I just want to clarify something before it becomes integrated." The word was chosen deliberately, a reflection of Gloria's language. Gloria's smile held. "What is there to clarify?" she asked. Peyton opened the folder. Inside, the documents were arranged in precise order. She did not hand them out immediately. She began with the first. A certified DNA report, she said, her tone unchanged. Court admissible, verified independently by 2 laboratories. She placed a copy on the table in front of Gloria. Then another, closer to the center. For reference, she added. No emphasis, no accusation, just presentation. Santiago's posture shifted. Subtly, but enough. Peyton continued. "It confirms," she said, "that Santiago Reyes is not the biological father of Lucas Bennett." Silence followed. Not immediate reaction, not denial, just absence of movement. Because the statement did not invite interpretation. It concluded. Gloria's expression did not change immediately, but something beneath it did. A recalculation. Santiago stepped forward. "Peyton," he said, his voice controlled, "this isn't She did not look at him. She did not respond to him, because the conversation was no longer between them. She placed the second document on the table. A summary of financial transfers, she said, from Santiago Reyes to Aaron Cole, over a 6-month period. Each page was aligned, each entry clear. Documented, she continued, consistent, correlated with the timeline of medical diagnosis. The word diagnosis entered the space without explanation. It did not need one. Gloria's hand tightened slightly around her glass. Still no interruption. Peyton placed the final document. A transcript, she said, from a recorded conversation. She paused, not for effect, but for completion, in which both knowledge of Santiago's condition and the decision to construct this narrative were acknowledged. Now she looked at Gloria. Not confrontational, not emotional, just direct. No one spoke, because there was nothing to interrupt, no argument to counter, no uncertainty to question. The structure Gloria had built publicly, deliberately, confidently, had just been dismantled in the same space, for the same audience. Peyton closed the folder. That's all she said. No elaboration, no accusation, no raised voice, just completion. She stepped back. The room did not return to conversation, not immediately, because what had been introduced did not require interpretation. It required acknowledgement. And for the first time that evening, Gloria Reyes did not speak. Silence, when it follows certainty, carries a different weight than silence before it. What settled over the room after Peyton finished speaking was not confusion. It was recognition, slow, unavoidable, and deeply inconvenient for those who had already accepted a different version of events. No one moved immediately. Not Gloria, not Santiago, not the board members whose presence had transformed the evening from private affirmation into public consequence. The documents on the table did not demand attention. They commanded it. Gloria remained standing at the center of the room, her hand still lightly curved around the stem of her glass. Her expression, refined through years of control, did not fracture. But it adjusted subtly, almost imperceptibly, as calculation replaced certainty. She did not reach for the documents, not yet, because reaching would signal acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would shift the ground beneath her. Santiago was the first to attempt movement. "This isn't appropriate," he said, his voice controlled, but edged with urgency that had not been present before. The statement, however, lacked direction. It did not dispute the evidence. It did not address the content. It targeted the moment. Peyton did not respond, because the moment was no longer his to define. A member of the board, an older man whose influence extended beyond formal titles, stepped closer to the table. He did not ask permission. He did not announce his intention. He simply picked up the top document, the DNA report. His eyes moved across the page with practiced efficiency, the kind developed over decades of reviewing contract statements and disclosures where precision mattered more than presentation. He did not speak immediately, but his posture changed. That Peyton noted was enough. Others followed, not all at once, but in sequence. A woman seated near the far end of the table stood moving closer. Another executive leaned forward, scanning the financial summary. The transcript remained untouched for a moment longer, as if its implications required a different kind of readiness. Gloria watched them, not with panic, not openly, but with a level of attention that suggested something had shifted beyond her immediate control. "Santiago," she said finally, her voice even though quieter than before. "Would you like to explain this?" The phrasing was deliberate, not denial, not dismissal, redirection. Santiago hesitated. For the first time that evening, his composure did not align perfectly with the environment around him. "It's being misrepresented," he said. The words were measured, but insufficient. Which part, the older board member asked without looking up from the document. The question was precise, contained. It did not allow for generalization. Santiago's gaze moved briefly toward Peyton, then back to the room. "The context," he said. "It's more complicated than the report is not contextual," the man replied. "It's biological." The distinction was clear and final. Gloria stepped forward, then closing the distance between herself and the table. She reached for the document at last, lifting it with controlled movement, her eyes scanning the contents with a speed that suggested both familiarity with such materials and an unwillingness to linger. When she finished, she placed it back down carefully. This, she said, does not change the reality of our family. The statement was composed, but it no longer carried the same authority, because the room had shifted. Reality, Peyton understood, was no longer being defined solely by Gloria. It changes the claim, the woman near the table said quietly, not confrontational, but precise. Gloria turned toward her. Our family's stability is not dependent on accuracy, was described as secondary. The same woman interrupted gently, glancing at the transcript Peyton had placed on the table. According to this, her tone remained calm, but the implication was direct. Gloria's gaze flickered just briefly toward the transcript. She did not reach for it. Santiago exhaled sharply. "This is private," he said. "It shouldn't have been recorded." That was the first shift toward challenge, not of the facts, but of their existence. Peyton met his gaze for the first time since she had spoken. It was legal, she said. Her voice remained even. Nothing more, nothing less. The room absorbed the exchange, because legality, once introduced, reframed the situation. This was no longer simply a personal dispute. It was something with implications that extended beyond the immediate. Erin had not moved. She remained near Lucas, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed on the floor for most of the exchange. But when the attention shifted toward the transcript, she looked up briefly, her gaze moving toward Peyton. There was no accusation in it, only understanding. Because what had been spoken privately now existed where it could not be contained. Lucas, unaware, continued to play with a small object in his hands, the quiet rhythm of his movement contrasting sharply with the stillness around him. Peyton observed him for a moment, not as part of the structure, but as something separate from it. Then she returned her attention to the room. A second board member spoke. "This has implications," he said, his tone measured, "not just personally." He did not need to elaborate. The connection between Gloria's public statement and the company's perceived stability had already been established. If representations have been made based on inaccurate information, they have not. Gloria said, her voice sharper now, though still controlled. No formal documentation has been altered. A careful defense. Technical, narrow. But the room did not fully accept it. Perception matters, the older man replied, particularly when it intersects with leadership continuity. There it was, not accusation, but recognition of risk. Santiago stepped forward again. "This is being escalated unnecessarily," he said. "There's no impact on operations." Peyton did not respond. She did not need to, because the room had already moved beyond operational considerations. It was now assessing credibility, and credibility, once questioned, did not restore easily. Gloria's posture straightened. "We will address this internally," she said, a statement intended to close, to contain. But the moment had already expanded beyond that. One of the guests, a woman whose role in the company involved external relations, spoke with careful precision. "It may not remain internal," she said. "Not if it has already been presented publicly in this context." Her gaze moved briefly around the room. Not accusing, just observing. The implication was clear. Witnesses existed. Narratives had been shared, and now contradicted. Peyton remained still, because this part was not hers to direct. The system was responding on its own, as it always did when inconsistencies reached a certain threshold. Santiago's expression tightened further. "This was a family matter," he said. "And it still is," Peyton replied quietly. The statement did not contradict him, but it reframed the boundary. Because what had been introduced as family had been extended into something else. And once extended, it could not be contained again. Silence returned. Not the same as before. Heavier, more defined. Gloria looked at Peyton. For the first time, there was no calculation in her expression. Only assessment. And perhaps recognition. "You should have come to me," Gloria said. The statement was not a question. Peyton met her gaze. "I did," she replied. A pause, repeatedly. Nothing more. The words settled, because they carried history, and history once acknowledged could not be revised in that moment. Peyton did not wait for resolution. She did not seek it, because what needed to happen had already begun. She stepped back fully, then returning to the space she had occupied before she spoke. Not retreating, not withdrawing, just removing herself from the center, because the center no longer required her. The structure had been presented, the contradiction established, the response initiated. And from that point forward, the outcome would no longer depend on her voice. The shift did not happen all at once. It moved through the room the way structural stress moves through a building, quiet at first, then undeniable once it reached a certain threshold. Conversations did not resume. They reformed smaller and more contained, as if each person present was recalibrating their position in relation to what had just been revealed. Peyton remained where she had stepped back, no longer the focal point, but still within the frame. She did not watch Gloria or Santiago continuously. Instead, she allowed her attention to move across the room, noting how alignment changed in real time. The older board member, who had first examined the DNA report, did not return it to the table. He held it, reading again more slowly this time, as though confirming that the initial interpretation had not been influenced by context or surprise. Beside him, another executive spoke in a low voice, not quite private, but not intended for the room at large. "If this is accurate," she said, "then the narrative we've been given is materially incomplete." The phrasing mattered. Not false, incomplete. A term that allowed room for correction, but still acknowledged deviation. Gloria heard it. Her posture remained controlled, but the stillness she had maintained began to take on a different quality, not composure, but containment. "We have not misrepresented anything in a formal capacity," she said, her tone measured each word placed carefully. "This is a personal matter that has been interpreted beyond its scope." The distinction she attempted to draw was precise. Personal versus formal. But the room had already crossed that boundary. Introduced in this setting, the older man replied, "Lifting the document slightly, it becomes both." There was no aggression in his voice. Only clarity. Santiago moved again, his steps deliberate, his presence now carrying an edge that had not been there earlier in the evening. "This isn't productive," he said. "We're discussing something that doesn't affect operations governance or the financial transfers do," another voice interrupted. This time, it came from a man standing near the far side of the table, one who had remained silent until now. He held the summary Peyton had provided, his gaze fixed on the numbers. "These are not incidental," he continued. "They suggest coordination. Coordination." The word entered the space with weight. Santiago's response was immediate. "They were personal support," he said. Nothing more. The explanation was simple. But simplicity, Peyton knew, often weakened under scrutiny. "For 6 months," the man replied, with variable labeling, a pause. "That raises questions. Questions, not accusations." Yet, Gloria stepped forward, slightly reclaiming space. "We will review any concerns internally," she said. "There is no need to speculate in this environment." Again, containment. Again, control. But control, once challenged, publicly required reinforcement from others to hold. And the room was no longer uniformly aligned. Peyton observed Aaron then. She had not moved from her position beside Lucas, but her stillness had shifted. It was no longer passive. It was deliberate. Her gaze lifted not toward Gloria or Santiago, but toward the individuals now examining the documents. There was no attempt to intervene, no attempt to defend, only presence. And in that presence, something became clear. Aaron would not contradict what had been presented. Silence in this case aligned with truth. Peyton noted it, because absence of contradiction when stakes were high carried its own form of confirmation. Near the center of the room, the transcript remained on the table. Untouched until now. The woman who had referenced it earlier reached for it, lifting the pages carefully, her eyes moving across the text with focused attention. The room did not quiet further. It did not need to. The act of reading carried its own gravity. After a moment, she spoke. "This language is specific," she said. "It acknowledges prior knowledge." She did not look up immediately. Then, and intent. The words settled. More precise than coordination. More difficult to deflect. Gloria's gaze moved to her. "Context matters," she said. "It does," the woman replied. "Which is why this is concerning. No escalation, no raised voices." But the alignment had shifted further. Santiago exhaled slowly, his patience thinning. "This was recorded without consent," he said. "That alone, should it was legal," the older man repeated, not looking at him. The repetition closed the line of argument. Because legality once established removed that avenue entirely. Santiago's focus shifted then to Peyton. For the first time since she had spoken, his composure broke just enough to reveal something beneath it. Not anger, not fully, something closer to recognition. "You planned this," he said. The statement was quiet, but direct. Peyton met his gaze. "I prepared," she replied. The distinction was intentional. Planning implied strategy against. Preparation implied readiness for. Santiago held her gaze a moment longer, then looked away. Because there was nothing in her expression that could be used against her. No hostility, no satisfaction, only clarity. At the far end of the room, two board members stepped aside, briefly speaking in lower tones. Their conversation was not audible, but their posture suggested evaluation not of Peyton, but of the situation itself. Peyton understood what was happening. The system was responding, not emotionally, structurally, assessing risk, assessing credibility, assessing exposure. And once those assessments began, they rarely reversed without resolution. Gloria recognized it too. Her next words reflected adjustment. "We will cooperate with any review deemed necessary," she said, her tone regaining some of its earlier control. "But I will not allow this family to be defined by a single interpretation, a reframing, attempting to shift from fact to perspective." But the documents on the table did not operate within interpretation. They existed independently of it. The older man placed the DNA report back down. "This is not interpretation," he said. "It's verification." He looked at Gloria directly. "And it changes the basis of what has been presented here tonight." No hostility, just conclusion. Silence followed again. Not uncertain, not waiting, but settled, because the direction had been established. Peyton did not move. She did not speak, because her role in this moment had ended. Everything that followed now belonged to the system Gloria had extended herself into, the company, the board, the network of individuals, whose decisions would now be informed by what had been introduced. Santiago stood still, his posture rigid, his gaze unfocused for a moment, as if recalculating paths that no longer aligned. Erin lowered her eyes again, her hand resting lightly on Lucas's shoulder. The child looked up briefly, sensing the stillness, then returned to his quiet movement. Peyton observed him one last time. Not as evidence, not as part of the case, but as something separate, something that had been placed into a structure he did not create. Then she looked back at the room, because what had been set in motion would not resolve immediately. It would unfold through meetings, through reviews, through decisions made behind closed doors. But its outcome had already been determined the moment the truth was placed where it could not be ignored. And Peyton Hayes understood something with complete certainty. She did not need to stay to see it happen. Peyton did not leave immediately, not because she needed to witness the aftermath, and not because she expected resolution to occur within the same evening, but because departure, like every other action she had taken, required placement. Leaving too soon would have suggested avoidance. Staying too long would have implied attachment. So she remained. Long enough for the room to begin reorganizing itself around what had been introduced. The dinner did not resume in any conventional sense. Conversations did not return to their earlier rhythm, nor did Gloria attempt to reclaim the narrative through force. Instead, the atmosphere shifted into something quieter, more contained, as if each person present had moved inward, reassessing what they had heard and what it meant for their own position within the broader structure. Several of the board members gathered near the far side of the room, speaking in low, deliberate tones. Their posture was not confrontational, but it was no longer passive. Documents were referenced again, not with urgency, but with the kind of focus that suggested follow-up rather than dismissal. Gloria did not approach them. That Peyton noted was significant. Control when intact moved toward challenge. Control when compromised paused. Santiago stood near the center of the room for several minutes without engaging anyone directly. His attention shifted between groups as if calculating where to enter, where to regain footing. But each time he seemed ready to speak, the moment passed, because there was no clear entry point left. Everything that could be said had already been overtaken by what had been shown. Eventually, one of the executives approached Gloria. The conversation between them was quiet, but not entirely private. "We'll need to address this formally," the woman said, her tone professional measured. "Soon." Gloria inclined her head slightly. "Of course," she replied. No resistance, no deflection, only acknowledgement. That more than anything confirmed the shift. Peyton moved then, not toward the center, not toward Gloria, but toward the exit. She did not announce her departure. She did not seek attention or acknowledgement. Her movement was consistent with the way she had entered, aligned with expectation, unobtrusive, complete. As she reached for her coat, Santiago intercepted her. Not abruptly, but with enough intention to interrupt her path. "Peyton," he said. His voice was lower now, controlled, but lacking the certainty it had carried earlier in the evening. She turned to face him. What was the purpose of that, he asked. The question was not accusatory in tone, but it carried weight. Peyton considered him for a moment. Not his words, his position. Then she answered. "Clarity," she said. The same word she had used before. Unchanged. Santiago exhaled a brief release of tension that did not resolve anything. "You could have handled this differently," he said. Peyton's gaze remained steady. "I did," she replied. A pause. Repeatedly. The words mirrored what she had said to Gloria, because the truth did not change based on audience. Santiago looked at her, searching for something, perhaps reaction, perhaps justification, but found neither. "This affects more than just us," he said. Peyton nodded slightly. "I'm aware." "Then why?" "Because it already did," she said, interrupting him for the first time. Not sharply, but precisely. Santiago's expression shifted. Not confusion, recognition, because he understood what she meant. The moment Gloria had introduced Lucas publicly, the moment the narrative had been extended into professional space, the moment truth had been replaced with construction, the impact had already expanded beyond them. Peyton did not elaborate further. She did not need to. Santiago stepped back slightly, not in defeat, but in recalibration. "Are you leaving?" he asked. "Yes," Peyton said, not as an emotional response. As a fact, there was a brief silence between them. "Then, we need to talk," he said. Peyton held his gaze. "There's nothing left to clarify," she replied. Another pause, not verbally. The distinction settled between them, because Peyton had never relied on conversation to resolve what evidence had already established. Santiago looked at her for a moment longer, then nodded once. Not agreement, acceptance of the moment as it was. Peyton turned and continued toward the door. No one stopped her. No one called her name, because the center of the room had already shifted away from her. And that she understood was the final confirmation she needed. Outside, the air was cool, steady, unchanged by what had occurred inside. Peyton walked to her car without urgency, her steps, even her posture, unaltered. She did not look back. Not because she was avoiding anything, but because there was nothing behind her that required further attention. The following days unfolded without direct contact from Gloria. That absence was not surprising. It indicated strategy, internal alignment, assessment. Santiago, however, reached out once. A message. Short. "We need to discuss next steps." Peyton read it, then set her phone down, because next steps had already been defined. "Through counsel," through structure, through action. 2 days later, formal notice was served. The process was precise, legal, documented. Santiago received it at his office, not at home. That detail had been intentional, because location influenced response. At home, reaction might have been emotional. At work, it would be contained, structured, aligned with the environment. The filing included everything necessary to establish position, separation, asset disclosure requests, preliminary injunctions preventing movement of certain funds. Nothing excessive, nothing punitive, just complete. Santiago called that evening. Peyton answered. "Is this how you're handling it?" he asked. His tone was controlled, but the question carried an undercurrent of disbelief. "Yes," Peyton said. A pause. "You're not even willing to talk about it." "We are talking about it," she replied, "through the appropriate structure." Silence followed, because the structure she referred to did not allow for ambiguity. Only documentation, only response within defined parameters. "This doesn't have to be adversarial," Santiago said. Peyton considered that. "Then it isn't," she replied. Another pause. "Then what is it?" Peyton's answer came without hesitation. "Accurate." The word settled, because accuracy, unlike conflict, did not depend on agreement. It depended on evidence. Santiago did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter. "You've already decided everything," he said. Peyton looked out the window, her expression unchanged. "No," she said. "The facts did." The call ended shortly after, not abruptly, but without resolution. Because resolution in this context would not come through conversation. It would come through process. And process, once initiated, moved forward regardless of preference. Peyton closed her phone and set it aside. The apartment around her felt the same, unchanged. But its meaning had shifted, because she was no longer part of the structure that had defined it, not emotionally, not legally, not in any way that required continuation. She moved through the space once more, not as someone leaving in haste, but as someone completing a transition already decided. Each action was deliberate, measured, aligned, because departure, like everything else she had done, was not reaction. It was conclusion. The transition did not announce itself. It unfolded quietly, the way most decisive changes did when they had already been completed long before they became visible. Peyton did not leave the apartment in a single moment of finality. There was no abrupt packing, no visible rupture, no symbolic gesture that marked the end of one life and the beginning of another. Instead, she moved through the space over several days, organizing, separating, and documenting with the same precision she had applied to everything else. What belonged to her was identified clearly. What did not was left untouched. There was no negotiation within the space itself, no attempt to assign meaning to objects that had once been shared. The meaning had already been removed from them the moment the structure of the relationship had been reduced to documented fact. Boxes were packed, not hurriedly, not emotionally, but completely. Each item placed with intention, each record preserved where necessary, each absence noted without commentary. Santiago was not present during most of this process. That too had been arranged, through counsel, through timing. Because presence in moments like this often introduced variables that did not serve the outcome. When he did return one evening, it was to a space that had already begun to shift. Not empty, but no longer shared. He stood in the doorway for a moment, his gaze moving across the room, as if searching for something that could not be located physically. Peyton was seated at the table, reviewing a final set of documents. She looked up. There was no tension in her expression, no hostility, only acknowledgement. "You're moving out," Santiago said. It was not a question. Peyton nodded. "Yes." He stepped further into the room, setting his keys down more slowly than usual. When he asked, "Tomorrow," she replied. A pause followed. Not long, but enough. Santiago looked at the boxes, then back at her. "This is final," he said. Again, not a question. Peyton closed the document in front of her. Yes, there was no elaboration, because finality once reached did not require explanation. Santiago exhaled the sound quiet, controlled. "We built something," he said. The statement lingered between them. Peyton considered it, not as memory, but as structure. "Yes," she said. Another pause. "And it's just over." The word just carried weight, as if simplicity could reduce what had occurred. Peyton met his gaze. "It ended when it stopped being accurate," she said. The phrasing was consistent, not emotional, not accusatory, but precise. Santiago looked at her for a moment longer, as if expecting something more, something less controlled, less structured, more aligned with the way endings were usually expressed. But Peyton did not offer that. Because what they had shared had not ended in a moment. It had ended in layers, in decisions, in silence, in alignment with something that no longer included her. "There was a way to handle this differently," he said. Peyton did not disagree. "There are always multiple ways," she replied. A pause. This was the one that reflected what happened. Santiago's gaze shifted slightly, not away from her, but inward, as if recalculating something that no longer aligned with the assumptions he had been operating under. And now he asked. Peyton stood, not abruptly, just enough to signal transition. Now, she said, the process continues. The word process carried the weight of everything that had been set in motion. Legal, financial, structural. Santiago nodded once. Not agreement, recognition, because he understood finally that there was no space left for negotiation that did not exist within that structure. Peyton moved past him, gathering the final folder from the table. There was no need for further conversation. Everything that could be said had already been addressed, not in words, but in actions. The next morning she left. No announcement, no audience, just departure. The building's hallway was quiet, the elevator arriving without delay, the city outside continuing its rhythm without interruption. Peyton placed her belongings into the car with the same care she had used when packing them. Each movement deliberate, each step aligned with completion rather than escape. When she closed the trunk, she paused for a moment, not to look back, but to recognize the absence of anything that required continuation. Then she left. Her new apartment was smaller, not temporary, not transitional, just sufficient. The space reflected function rather than history. Clean lines, minimal furnishings, no inherited expectations. Peyton arranged her belongings without urgency, placing each item where it belonged, not based on habit, but on clarity. Work resumed without interruption. Her role had not changed. Her responsibilities remained intact. If anything, the absence of external pressure allowed for sharper focus. Her case file, once active, shifted into a different phase, handled by counsel, progressing through defined channels. There were updates, of course, communications from Claire, requests for documentation, responses from Santiago's legal representation. But none of it required Peyton to step outside the structure she had established. Everything moved as it should, because it had been built to do so. Weeks passed, then months. The Reyes Group initiated an internal review, not publicly announced, but confirmed through formal channels. Gloria's position, while not immediately removed, became subject to oversight. Santiago's role shifted as well. Less visible, more contained. The narrative they had constructed did not disappear overnight. But it no longer held, because once contradiction entered a system with sufficient evidence, stability required adjustment. Peyton did not follow the details closely, not because they lacked significance, but because they no longer required her attention. Her involvement had ended the moment the truth had been placed where it could not be ignored. Everything that followed belonged to the structure itself. One evening, as she sat by the window of her new apartment, the city stretched out in front of her, unchanged in its movement, its noise, its patterns. Lights flickered. Cars passed. Conversations happened behind windows she would never enter. Peyton rested her hands lightly on the table in front of her. There was no sense of victory, no satisfaction in outcome. Only stillness. Not the silence she had carried before. Not the silence that stored. but the kind that remained after everything unnecessary had been removed. Because in the end, Peyton Hayes had not needed to argue. She had not needed to defend. She had not needed to prove herself within a structure that had already decided her role. She had simply documented, aligned, and when the time came presented, the rest had followed. Without noise, without spectacle, without her needing to stay. The truth does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it gathers quietly, precisely, until it no longer needs a voice to be heard. Peyton never raised hers. She didn't argue, didn't chase acknowledgement, didn't demand justice in the way people expect to see it. She simply let facts stand where they could no longer be ignored. And in doing so, she changed everything without ever losing control of herself. Some stories don't end with confrontation. They end with clarity, with distance, with a quiet understanding that dignity isn't something you win back, it's something you refuse to give away in the first place. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to reflect on it. Where are you watching from and what time is it there right now? I read every comment. And if you believe that strength doesn't always need to be loud, that truth can move. Without force, you're welcome to stay for more stories like this.